Meridian Arch Station had a smell that no one who worked there ever quite got used to, and no one who left ever quite forgot. It was the smell of recycled air that had been recycled one too many times, of machine oil that had soaked into the ventilation grates sometime in the station's third decade and never entirely left, of synthetic coffee brewed in quantities that suggested either great enthusiasm or deep despair, and underneath all of it, faint and persistent, the cold metallic breath of deep space leaking in through hull, seems that the maintenance logs described as within acceptable parameters, which was the engineering equivalent of saying a wound was healing, while quietly hoping no one looked too closely. Eli Voss had been docked at Meridian Arch for 6 months, which was 5 months and 3 weeks longer than he had originally planned, and the smell had become his smell, a fact he found objectionable every time he returned to the second-hand remark after a shift and caught a trace of himself in the recycled air of his own ship. The remark was a mid-range Paralis-class cargo hauler, 11 years old, with a drive system that had been rebuilt twice and a navigational array that was, in Eli's own assessment, smarter than most of the people he'd worked for. She was not a beautiful ship. She was the kind of ship that inspired confidence rather than admiration, which Eli had always considered the more useful quality. He maintained her with a thoroughness that several of the docking crew had described, behind his back and occasionally to his face, as concerning, and he kept his own quarters, a converted storage bay off the mid-corridor, fitted with a bunk that folded into the wall and a shelf that held 3 books he had read until their spines gave out, with a disorder that suggested a man who had decided early that there were only so many things worth caring for and had been ruthless about the list. He was 34 years old. He had a transport license that had been suspended twice and revoked once, all 3 incidents stemming from the same fundamental character trait, which various official documents had described variously as insubordination, willful disregard of advisory routing, and memorably, an apparent conviction that regulations are suggestions addressed to other people. He had 11 certifications across as many vessel classes. He had never, in 14 years of professional flight, lost cargo or crew, a record he did not mention because he considered it the minimum standard rather than an achievement, the same way he did not take pride in breathing. The other pilots at Meridian Arch respected him with the particular wariness of people who recognize competence that has no interest in being liked. He had first become aware of Lyran, the way you become aware of a sound you cannot identify, not alarming, not quite ignorable, present in a way that resists easy categorization. She was the station's senior structural and atmospheric engineer, assigned to the 3rd ring, which was the ring that held together least enthusiastically and therefore required the most attention from someone who understood why. Eli had noticed her in the commissary, in the service corridors. At the edge of briefings, she had not been required to attend but appeared at anyway, standing near the back with a data tablet and the expression of someone auditing the quality of the information being distributed. She was, to a first glance, nearly human, the kind of nearly that most people didn't examine past because the first glance satisfied the brain's basic categorization requirements and the brain moved on to other matters. Eli had not moved on entirely, though he had not allowed himself to fully arrive, either. He occupied a careful middle distance. He had noted the fine luminescent lines that ran along her jaw and curved below each ear in low light, the blue-white of something deep and bioluminescent, something that had evolved in conditions where light was a private decision. He had noted that her eyes were amber in a way that amber was not quite, the color carrying a slow interior movement like weather seen from altitude. He had noted her hands, which had the right count of fingers and the wrong geometry of proportion, a half joint too long, moving when she gestured with a fluid deliberateness that made ordinary human gesture seem slightly approximate by comparison. He had noted all of this in the same peripheral, unsanctioned way that he noted the 2% variance on his port thruster, filed, monitored, not yet acted upon. What he had learned about her professionally was that she was exceptionally good at her work, which on Meridian Arch meant that the third ring had not killed anyone during her tenure, a distinction her predecessor had not managed in his final quarter. She had once slipped a set of docking calculations under his cockpit door on actual paper, folded once, without explanation or signature, and the calculations had been correct to the fifth decimal. He had kept the paper. He would have been unable to explain why if asked, so he had ensured he was not asked, which was not difficult, as no one on Meridian Arch was in the habit of asking Eli Voss personal questions. They had arrived at this arrangement by mutual convenience, and maintained it with the satisfaction of a treaty that suits both parties. The first indication that something was wrong arrived on a Tuesday, which was its own kind of cruelty, and it arrived not as an alarm but as a number. A small, quiet deviation in the gravity generation array's output readings, filed in a maintenance report by Lyron at 11:40 hours and distributed to 3 supervisors, none of whom read it before end of shift. She had marked it priority 2. She knew, in the precise and unhappy way that engineers know things they haven't finished knowing yet, that she should have marked it priority 1. She marked it priority 2 anyway, because the data was not yet catastrophic, only uncomfortable, and she was a person who believed in measured responses to incomplete evidence. The universe, it turned out, did not share this philosophy. The cascade failure in the gravity generation array began at 3:47 station time, which is the hour that exists specifically to ensure that whatever goes wrong in front of people who are operating on 3 hours of sleep and the metabolic residue of synthetic coffee. It did not begin with an explosion. It did not begin with any of the dramatic indicators that the station's emergency training simulations had spent considerable budget preparing the crew to recognize. It began with a sound, a low, structural moan rising from somewhere deep in the station's third ring, a sound that the older crew members identified immediately and correctly, and that the newer crew members spent approximately 40 seconds misidentifying as a pressure calibration drill before the second moan arrived, pitched lower and longer, carrying in it the specific harmonic of metal being asked to do something it had not been engineered to do. The lights shifted from white to amber at 3:49. The amber of preliminary evacuation was a particular shade that the station's original designers had selected from a safety manual written by people who had clearly never been in an actual emergency. A color that managed to be simultaneously alarming and somehow bureaucratic, as though the station itself was filing a formal complaint about what was happening to it. At 3:51, the PA system attempted to issue evacuation instructions, and instead issued 3 separate automated announcements simultaneously, overlapping into a compound message that contained the words "all personnel, non-essential." And this is not a drill, in an order that suggested someone in the control room had achieved a new personal record in button pressing under pressure. Eli Voss was already in his seat. This was not preparedness in any heroic sense. It was simply the arithmetic of a circadian rhythm that had never recovered from a contract 11 years prior that required crossing 17 time zones in a single month, and which had responded by abandoning the concept of a fixed sleep schedule entirely in favor of a more improvisational approach. He had been in the second-hand remarks cockpit since 3:10, running a pre-flight checklist he did not strictly need to run and drinking something that his ship's fabricator described as coffee and that he had stopped arguing with. When the amber light washed through his canopy, he was already in his harness, already looking at his engine readouts, and already making a list. The list was not long. It was the kind of list that forms in the minds of people who have been in enough emergencies to understand that emergencies are not complicated. They are simply fast, and the way you survive them is by refusing to match their pace and instead maintaining your own. Item 1. Primary engines to full standby. Item 2. Assess docking clamp integrity. Item 3. establish which other ships in the bay were going to make it out. He answered item 3 in approximately 4 seconds by looking at the bay cameras. The medical courier on Bay 7 had taken a gravity shear across her forward hull that had compromised her nose seal. She was venting, slowly, and her pilot was either not aboard or not awake. The freight hauler on Bay 12 had been in for engine service for 2 weeks. Both drives disassembled across a work floor that was now experiencing intermittent gravity fluctuations, which meant that several hundred kilograms of precision engine components were gently and catastrophically redistributing themselves across the maintenance bay. 3 other ships were already gone, cleared in the first minutes, their docking corridors cycling closed behind them with the mechanical indifference of systems that did not grade departures on urgency. The second-hand remark was, as far as Eli could determine, the last ship in Meridian Arch's docking ring with functioning engines, a full fuel load, and a pilot who was already holding the launch sequence at the last confirmation prompt. He was watching the bay corridor feeds and thinking about his port thruster variants, and monitoring the station's structural integrity readouts, which were producing numbers that the readout display had apparently not been calibrated to show, because several of them had simply rendered as a row of question marks, which Eli found briefly blackly funny in the way that only genuinely terrible situations can produce genuine humor, the universe shrugging, the instruments throwing up their hands. He was composing his emergency departure filing to the nearest relay beacon, which he was doing partly because it was protocol, and mostly because focusing on protocol is how you keep your hands from doing anything counterproductive, when his external airlock camera showed him a figure in the corridor. She was moving fast, the way people move when they have assessed the situation with precision and decided that speed was the appropriate variable to adjust. She had a single bag over one shoulder, one bag, which told him she had grabbed what mattered and left everything else, which told him she had made decisions rather than choices, which was a distinction he respected deeply. The corridor behind her was beginning to show the visible distortions of a localized gravity variance, the overhead lighting swaying on its mounts, a loose panel cover lifting slightly from the wall and hanging in the air at an angle that had no business existing. The luminescent lines along her jaw were burning a brighter, more urgent blue than he had ever seen them, the light pulsing faintly in a rhythm he did not recognize, but that seemed, in its tempo, to resemble something like controlled fear. He opened the airlock before she reached it. He did this without deliberation, without consulting the passenger manifest protocols or the liability provisions of his transport license, or any of the other documentary infrastructure that existed to regulate decisions that, in practice, made themselves. He opened it because she was there and his ship was going to leave, and those two facts, placed next to each other, produced only one response in any person who intended to remain the kind of person they could tolerate being. He was already back at his launch sequence by the time she entered the corridor. The airlock cycled. The varying engineering of threshold and crossing and the weight of certain words was not a thing Eli Voss knew anything about at 3:54 on a Tuesday morning, with one hand on the thrust control and his eyes on a structural integrity readout that had just rendered 3 more question marks. He knew the sound of the airlock sealing, the pressure equalization, the long mechanical exhale, the deep magnetic finality of the lock engaging. He had heard it hundreds of times. It was the sound of a door becoming a wall, of an outside becoming permanently outside, and he had never found it remarkable before. She appeared in the cockpit doorway 11 seconds later. Her hair had escaped its binding. The bag was still on her shoulder as though she had not yet decided whether she was staying. The traces on her jaw were a color he had no name for. She looked at him, and he looked at the console, and she said 4 words in the tone of someone completing a sentence that the universe had been holding open. "Just us then, go." He went. The second-hand remark cleared Meridian Arch's outer marker at emergency thrust and kept going, because Eli Voss was not the kind of pilot who eased off the moment the immediate danger was behind him. He was the kind of pilot who put distance between himself and a problem, until the problem was a sensor reading rather than a reality. And so he flew hard for 11 minutes without speaking, without looking away from his instruments, and without acknowledging the woman standing in his cockpit doorway in any way that might be interpreted as an invitation to begin a conversation before he was ready for one. Behind them, on the rear camera array, Meridian Arch Station came apart. It did not explode. Eli had half expected an explosion, the way you half expect the punctuation at the end of a terrible sentence, but the station dissolved instead, which was in some ways worse. The gravity cascade took the structural cohesion out of the third ring first, and the rest followed with a slow, almost graceful inevitability. The whole apparatus of the station spreading outward from its center in a broadening ring of debris that caught the light of the nearest moon and glittered with horrible beauty. 6 months of Eli's life in recycled air and synthetic coffee, and the smell of machine oil, tumbling gently away from its own center. He watched it for exactly 3 seconds on the rear camera, and then returned his attention to his course heading, because there was nothing useful his attention could do for it now. Lyran had, at some point in the 11 minutes, sat down in the co-pilot chair. She had not asked. He had not objected. The co-pilot chair on the second-hand remark had been occupied by cargo manifests, and a jacket he kept meaning to move, and once memorably, a navigation computer he was in the process of replacing, but never by an actual co-pilot, because Eli had always found the concept of a co-pilot philosophically incompatible with his approach to flight, which was that decisions made by committees tended to have the quality of decisions made by committees. Lyran sat in it with the careful posture of someone who understood they were in borrowed space and intended to be a good tenant, her bag finally on the floor between her feet, her hands folded in her lap, watching the debris field on her side of the canopy with an expression he couldn't see from his angle and found he was curious about, which was itself a new development. He finished his post-launch checks. He filed his emergency departure notification with the relay beacon at waypoint 7, which acknowledged receipt with an automated response so aggressively cheerful in its formatting that he briefly considered that it had been written by someone who had never experienced an emergency. He ran a fuel assessment. He checked the port thruster variance, which had, in the chaos, resolved itself to 1.8%, as though the emergency had frightened it into better behavior. He did all of this with methodical patience, and then he sat back, and there was a silence in the cockpit that had a particular quality, the quality of a silence that is waiting for something. "There is something I should tell you," Lyran said, "about what just happened," said Eli, which was not agreement and not dismissal, and she apparently decided it was sufficient. What followed was 8 minutes of the most carefully structured information delivery he had ever received, and he had once sat through a 6-hour safety briefing on deep field radiation protocols that had been written by someone with a gift for thoroughness and no gift whatsoever for mercy. She began with principles, which he would later understand was how her people approached difficult personal subjects. From the architecture outward, the philosophical load-bearing walls first, then the rooms, then the furniture, then the thing sitting in the chair that you hadn't noticed yet. She explained the varying understanding of commitment as a physical act rather than a verbal one. She explained the threshold as a concept, the liminal space between states of being, a crossing point that carries weight precisely because what is on one side of it is genuinely different from what is on the other. She explained that for her people, a threshold bonding was not a ceremony in the way that human ceremonies were ceremonies, a thing scheduled and witnessed and catered, but rather a recognition, a naming of a truth that the crossing itself created. He listened to all of this with the expression of a man who is not yet having a reaction, because he is committed to receiving complete information before he allocates his reactions. a discipline he had developed over years of situations in which the people who reacted first tended to react most incorrectly. Then she explained the words, the formal invocation, the naming of the crossing party, just us, the weight those two words carried in the varying legal and spiritual framework, the specificity of them, the explicit declaration of exclusivity in the moment of passage. She explained it carefully, with the precision of someone who had been thinking about how to explain it for some time, possibly for longer than the length of this particular flight. He was beginning to have a suspicion. The suspicion was arriving in the manner of a slow-moving freighter, visible from a long way off, impossible to mistake for something else, impossible to stop once it had committed to the docking corridor. Then she said the part about the door. The closing of the threshold, she said, is the completion of the act. Once the passage is complete, the bonding cannot be undone. There was a silence. So, Eli said, in the voice he used when reading back navigation coordinates to confirm he had not misheard the numbers, when the airlock, yes, and the seal engaging, yes. He looked at his hands on the console. He looked at the debris field which had finished being a station and had committed fully to being a navigational hazard. He looked, briefly and sideways, at her. I was running a launch checklist, he said. I know. I was trying not to die. We both were. We were both, he said very slowly, trying not to die, and in the middle of that you said 4 words. He paused. He was aware that something in his voice was doing something he hadn't authorized it to do. Did you plan that? The pause she allowed before answering was exactly 1 second longer than a pause that means no. The evacuation, she said, with the composure of a woman who has decided that dignity is non-negotiable regardless of circumstances. I did not plan. She paused again, a shorter one. But I had considered for some time what I would say if a threshold presented itself. The proximity alarm announced a piece of the former commissary drifting into their flight corridor. Eli reached for the controls with the focused gratitude of a man who has been handed a task at precisely the right moment, and executed the correction with rather more concentration than it technically required. And the commissary debris tumbled away into the dark, and the second-hand remark continued at a steady 340 kilometers per second toward the waypoint, carrying 2 people and 1 closed door, and a silence that had, somewhere in the last 8 minutes, changed its quality entirely. The silence lasted 47 minutes. Eli knew because he watched the chronometer, not obsessively, just with the peripheral awareness of a man who has decided that tracking time is a more productive activity than examining what is happening inside his own chest. Lyron watched the stars, or appeared to, in the way that people appear to look at one thing while actually looking at something else entirely. The second-hand remark flew on without any opinion about any of it, maintaining her heading with the steady indifference of a ship that had carried stranger cargo. The waypoint's navigational beacon had resolved on sensors at approximately the 40-minute mark. A soft pulse on the long-range display that meant civilization, fueling infrastructure, and the kind of bureaucratic process that begins when an emergency departure arrives unscheduled with a non-manifest passenger, and a pilot whose license history reads like a cautionary tale written in 3 acts. Eli had been composing, silently, the explanation he would give to the waypoint docking authority, and he had arrived at a version he considered serviceable, which was that there had been an evacuation. He had evacuated, and he would be happy to discuss the paperwork when the paperwork was ready to discuss him. It was, he felt, appropriately minimal. What he had not been composing because he had not yet located the correct starting point was the other conversation, the one that was sitting in the co-pilot seat watching the stars. He reached into the cabinet behind the navigation console, the one that looked like an equipment housing because he had attached an equipment label to it, a precaution born of the entirely reasonable fear that someone might one day help themselves to his supplies during a long-haul layover, and removed a sealed cylinder of actual coffee. Real ground. He had 3 left. He set the fabricator to heat rather than brew because he was not a person who performed rituals performatively. And while it worked, he looked at the long-range sensors and he said, without preamble, because preamble was not a tool he had ever found useful, "Do you want this?" Lyran looked at the cylinder. She looked at him. Something moved through the traces along her jaw, a color that was neither the urgent blue of the evacuation nor the uncertain gold of the conversation that followed it, but something quieter, something that had decided it did not need to announce itself. "Yes," she said. He handed it to her. He took his own mug, the one that the fabricator produced without ceremony, and he turned back to the console and he said, "I want to ask you something and I need you to answer it plainly." "I will try," she said, which was, he thought, the most honest response available, and he credited it. "Do you want this?" he said again, and this time the emphasis was placed differently, the question aimed at something larger than a coffee cylinder. "Not the bonding, not the legal fact of it. I understand the legal fact of it. I mean, do you want the situation, the thing that is now true?" She was quiet. Not the quiet of evasion. He had learned enough of her rhythms in 6 months of peripheral attention to know the difference, but the quiet of someone choosing words with the seriousness they deserved. "My people," she said, "do not invoke the threshold carelessly. We are taught from early childhood what the words carry, the weight of them, the finality." She turned the coffee cylinder in her hands. "I have known those words my entire life, and I have never said them. Not because there was no one I might have said them to, but because I understood what it means to say them, and I did not want to say them imprecisely." Eli looked at the sensors, at the beacon pulse, at his own reflection faint and unconvincing in the dark of the canopy. "6 months," he said, "I have been on that station." "8," she said, "for me." "And in 8 months you never." "You make a face," she said. He turned. "I make a face. When someone begins a sentence that might require something of you, a specific contraction of the expression. Here." She indicated with one long finger the general region between his brows. "It discourages approach." "I was not aware," he said with great dignity, "that I make a face. You are making it right now." He understood, making it right now. He redistributed the relevant muscles with the deliberate effort of a man who has just been told he has an unintentional tell and intends to address it. And Lyran looked at her coffee cylinder, and the traces along her jaw did something brief and bright and entirely unguarded. A flash of light that he recognized, with a small internal shift, as the closest thing she had to a laugh. He stored that recognition somewhere he would be able to find it again. "The note," he said, "under my cockpit door, the docking calculations. The calculations were going to cause you a problem on your starboard approach. I could see it from the 3rd ring sensor array. You wrote them on paper." The station's data transfer had been running a 7-minute lag that week. Paper was faster. "You kept the paper," she said. He had not told her this. He looked at her. "How did you know that?" "I didn't," she said, and the traces did the brightness again. And this time he let his own expression do something it had been asking to do for the better part of an hour. A small involuntary rearrangement in the direction of something he hadn't felt in long enough that he'd stopped factoring it into his assessments of himself. The waypoint beacon strengthened on the display, close enough now that the docking authorities' automated greeting had begun to transmit. A recorded message of welcome that had clearly been recorded by someone compensating for the general bleakness of deep space waypoint infrastructure, with an excess of warmth. Eli acknowledged it with the minimum required response. He would need to file the emergency departure full report, produce Lyran's identification for the non-manifest passenger registry, answer questions about the station collapse that he was not yet equipped to answer, and navigate the entry into an entirely new phase of his life. A phrase he had not applied to himself in some years, and that sat in his thoughts with the novelty of something not yet worn in. "The varying bonding," he said, as the waypoint's running lights began to resolve on visual. "Is there anything I should know about it, practically?" She considered. There are acknowledgement filings with the varying civil registry. She paused. And there is a custom, in the first year, of learning one thing about the other person each day that you did not know before. One thing per day. Yes. He thought about the cabinet behind the navigation console, the one with the label on it. He thought about a fold of paper with numbers that went to the fifth decimal. He thought about 8 months of someone eating alone in a commissary, because competence worn like armor kept even the kindly at a distance, and how you could know a person for 6 months in the peripheral, unsanctioned way he had known her, and still have years of mornings ahead of you. I have, he said, 3 cylinders of actual coffee left. She looked at him steadily, with the amber eyes moving their slow interior weather. I know what you are telling me, she said. Good, said Eli Voss, and brought the second-hand remark in toward the waypoint lights with both hands on the controls and the quiet, settled certainty of a man who has, without entirely meaning to, arrived somewhere worth landing.